They heard it before they understood what it meant. A series of sharp cracks, 24 in rapid succession, like someone breaking wooden boards overhead. No thunder of depth charges hitting the water. No familiar countdown as the barrels tumbled through the waves. Just those cracks, then silence. Then nothing at all. Kapitänleutnant Hans-Joachim Hesse stood in the control room of U-415, 180 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic, and waited for the detonations that always came. His hydrophone operator sat motionless at his station, headphones pressed tight against his ears, listening. The crew held their breath. Silent running procedures demanded absolute quiet during depth charge attacks. No one moved. No one spoke. The detonations never came. Instead, at exactly 4 seconds after those strange cracking sounds, something struck the pressure hull amidships with the force of a locomotive. The explosion was not outside the boat, muffled by water and distance. It was inside, intimate, immediate. The hull ruptured. Seawater at 7 atmospheres of pressure blasted through the breach like a solid column of steel. Men died instantly, crushed by the incompressible fluid or drowned in the fraction of a second it took the ocean to claim their compartment. U-415 sank stern, first in less than 90 seconds. 43 men went down with her. 4 managed to reach the surface through a combination of training, position, and pure chance. They were picked up by HMS Bligh, the destroyer escort whose Hedgehog mortar had just introduced the Kriegsmarine to a weapon that changed the fundamental equation of undersea warfare. The date was July 14, 1944. The location was approximately 300 miles west of Brest, in the Bay of Biscay approaches that had become a graveyard for U-boats. Hesse had commanded U-415 for 8 months. He had survived 11 depth charge attacks. He knew the doctrine. He trusted his crew and his boat. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. None of it mattered against a weapon he had never been briefed about, operating on principles that made his training obsolete. The Hedgehog mortar did not announce itself with splashes and countdowns. It did not detonate on time delay fuses at preset depths. It armed itself in flight and exploded only on contact with a solid object. Which meant that if you heard the Hedgehog fire and nothing exploded, you were safe. But if something did explode, you were already dead. This was not how U-boat warfare was supposed to work. German submarine commanders had spent years mastering the art of evading depth charges. They understood the geometry of the attack, the timing, the psychology. They had developed tactics that gave them reasonable odds of survival, even against experienced escort crews. The British and Americans had dropped thousands of depth charges for every U-boat they killed. The attack was terrifying but survivable if you knew what you were doing. The Hedgehog changed that calculation completely. It removed the warning. It eliminated the evasion window. It turned submarine warfare into something far more absolute. Either the projectiles missed entirely and you survived, or they hit and you died. There was no middle ground, no near miss that let you count your luck and dive deeper. The men of U-415 discovered this in the worst possible way, through direct experience with no chance to learn from the encounter. But they were not the first U-boat crew to meet the Hedgehog, and they would not be the last. By July of 1944, the weapon had been sinking U-boats for over 2 years. The Kriegsmarine knew it existed. They had intelligence reports, captured equipment, interrogation transcripts from survivors. What they did not have was a counter-tactic, because there was none. 2. Understand what the Hedgehog took away from U-boat commanders. You have to understand what came before it. The depth charge was the primary anti-submarine weapon from 1916 onward, refined through 2 decades of development into a sophisticated system that nonetheless had fundamental limitations built into its design. A standard British depth charge in 1942, the Mark VII, was a cylindrical steel drum containing 300 pounds of menol explosive mixture. It weighed 420 pounds fully assembled. The weapon was designed to sink at a predictable rate, approximately 10 feet per second, while an internal hydrostatic pistol measured the increasing water pressure. When the charge reached a preset depth, anywhere from 50 feet to 500 feet, depending on how the crew set the pistol before dropping, the firing mechanism triggered. The explosion created a bubble of superheated gas that expanded rapidly, generating a shockwave through the water. If the shockwave was close enough to a submarine, within about 20 feet, the pressure could rupture the hull or damage critical systems. Further away, the effect diminished rapidly. Water is incompressible, which means shock waves travel through it efficiently, but they also dissipate quickly as the bubble expands and pressure equalizes. This created a specific tactical pattern that every U-boat commander learned in training at the submarine school in Neustadt. When destroyers or corvettes attacked with depth charges, you heard them hit the water. The splashes were distinctive, audible through the hull even at depth. Each splash gave you information. How many charges? What pattern? How close? Then came the critical seconds. The charges sank at 10 feet per second. If you were at 150 feet, and they were set for that depth, you had 15 seconds from splash to detonation. 15 seconds to do everything possible to survive. Emergency dive procedures, called for immediate action. Blow, negative tank to gain downward momentum. All ahead, full-on electric motors. Hard rudder to change position. Rig for depth charging, which meant securing loose equipment and bracing for impact. Experienced commanders developed an almost instinctive sense of timing. They counted the seconds. They estimated depths. They made split-second decisions about whether to dive deeper or turn hard or simply hold position and hope the attack pattern missed. The best commanders, men like Otto Kretschmer or Wolfgang Luth, survived dozens of depth charge attacks through a combination of skill, experience, and calculated risk-taking. The psychology of this was crucial. Yes, depth charging was terrifying. The explosions were loud enough to damage hearing even through the pressure hull. The boat shook violently. Equipment broke loose. Light bulbs shattered. Paint chips fell from the overhead like snow. Men vomited from the concussion. Some lost control of their bladders. But it was survivable. The numbers proved it. British destroyers in 1941 dropped an average of 120 depth charges for every U-boat killed. The success rate was less than 5%. A U-boat that survived the initial attack could often escape by going deep, staying quiet, and outlasting the escorts whose ASDIC sonar lost contact at depths below 200 feet. This created a brutal but comprehensible calculus. If you were competent, if your crew was trained, if your boat was mechanically sound, you had reasonable odds. Not good odds, but reasonable. You could learn from experience. You could develop tactics. You could teach new commanders what worked. German U-boat training reflected this reality. Commanders spent weeks in practice attacks, learning to recognize the sounds of different depth charge attacks, memorizing the timing, practicing emergency procedures until they became automatic reflexes. The instructors at Neustadt were combat veterans who taught specific techniques. How to use temperature layers in the water to hide from ASDIC. How to vent high-pressure air to create false echoes. How to lie on the bottom in shallow water and shut down everything except essential life support. These tactics worked often enough to sustain morale. By 1943, the average U-boat commander beginning his first patrol had absorbed 2 years of accumulated tactical knowledge. He knew the standard British depth charge patterns, the 5 pattern, where 5 charges were dropped in a diamond formation, the 10 pattern, a larger diamond with charges at the corners and centre, the barrage attack, where escorts saturated an area with dozens of charges set at varying depths. He knew the timing, he knew the sounds, he knew what a near miss felt like compared to a distant explosion. He had practiced in training boats in the Baltic, with instructors dropping small practice charges to simulate combat conditions. He had talked to veterans who survived multiple patrols and listened to their advice about what worked and what got you killed. This accumulated knowledge created confidence, or at least the appearance of confidence necessary to function in combat. The depth charge attack was terrible, yes, but it followed rules. It had patterns. you could develop expertise in surviving it. The weapon itself had limitations that a skilled commander could exploit. The charges had to be set to specific depths before being dropped. Once they hit the water, that setting could not be changed. If the U-boat commander dove deeper than the preset depth immediately after hearing the splashes, the charges would detonate above him, wasting their explosive energy in the wrong volume of water. If he stayed shallower than expected, they would detonate below him with similar ineffectiveness. The charges detonated on time delay fuses tied to depth, not on proximity or contact. This meant that even a near miss was still a miss. A charge that detonated 10 yards away was survivable. The shock wave would rattle the boat and terrify the crew, but the pressure hull would hold. Only a direct hit or a detonation within immediate proximity would kill. The attacking ship had to be nearly overhead to achieve accuracy. Depth charges rolled off stern racks or were thrown from side throwers, but in either case, the escort vessel had to pass over or very near the estimated U-boat position. This gave the submarine a small advantage. Once the escort passed overhead, you could turn hard and sprint away from that position, making the next attack pattern less accurate. All of these factors combined to create a system where skill mattered. A well-commanded U-boat with an experienced crew had perhaps a 70 to 80% chance of surviving an individual depth charge attack, assuming the escorts were competent but not exceptional. Over multiple patrols, those odds compounded, but they were still odds. You could calculate them. You could improve them through training. U-boat crews took pride in this expertise. Surviving a depth charge attack became a mark of professionalism. Commanders who brought their boats home after evading multiple attacks earned respect and decorations. The Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, Germany's highest military honor, was awarded to U-boat commanders who demonstrated exceptional skill and aggression. Many of those awards recognized not just ships sunk, but also the ability to survive sustained depth charging and bring the boat and crew home intact. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. In the claustrophobic, mechanically dependent environment of a Type 7 U-boat, where 70 men shared a pressure hull 220 feet long and 20 feet wide, confidence in survival tactics was essential to mental health. Men could function in those conditions, could spend weeks submerged in diesel fumes and body odor and constant mechanical noise, because they believed their commander knew how to keep them alive. The depth charge doctrine, for all its terror, supported that belief. It was survivable. Therefore, the mission was possible. Therefore, you could do your job without succumbing to panic or despair. The weapon that would render depth charge evasion tactics obsolete was developed not through revolutionary insight, but through incremental problem-solving by engineers who understood the mathematical limitations of existing systems. The Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar emerged from the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a British Admiralty department tasked with exploring unconventional solutions to tactical problems. The fundamental issue was this: depth charges required the attacking ship to pass directly over the submarine's estimated position before dropping weapons. This meant that in the critical seconds before the attack, the ship's ASDIC sonar lost contact with the target. The sonar transducer was mounted on the ship's hull, pointing downward and forward. As the ship closed to attack position, the submarine passed underneath the sonar's effective cone of detection. The escort was essentially blind during the final approach. This created a window where the submarine could maneuver without the attacking ship knowing. A hard turn to port or starboard, a sudden dive deeper, even just maintaining course while the escort guessed wrong, all of these options were available because the attacker had lost solid contact. Depth charge patterns tried to compensate by saturating a large area, but this was inefficient and required large numbers of weapons to achieve even modest success rates. Commander Charles Goodeve, working with the Directorate in 1940, proposed a solution. Instead of dropping charges from the stern or sides after passing over the target, why not fire projectiles forward while the ship still had ASDIC contact? The attacking vessel could maintain sonar tracking up until the SDIC, the moment of firing, calculate the target's exact position and depth, and then launch weapons that would land ahead of the ship while it was still tracking. The concept was sound. The engineering was challenging. The weapon that emerged from 18 months of development was unlike anything previously deployed. The Hedgehog consisted of 24 spigot mortars, arranged in 4 rows of 6, mounted on a steel frame that could be trained left or right, but not elevated. Each mortar was a simple steel tube with a fixed spigot at the bottom. The projectiles themselves were the clever part. Each was a streamlined steel bomb weighing 65 pounds, containing 32 pounds of Torpex explosive. Torpex was 50% more powerful than TNT by weight, a relatively new development that packed enormous destructive energy into a small package. The bombs were 7 inches in diameter at the widest point, shaped like stubby torpedoes with stabilizing fins at the rear. The firing mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. The projectiles sat on the spigots, held in place by their own weight. When the firing circuit was activated, a small cartridge at the base of each spigot detonated, driving the spigot upward into a cavity in the projectile's tail. This impulse launched the bomb forward and upward at approximately 45 degrees. The cartridges fired in rapid sequence, all 24 projectiles launching within 5 seconds. The bombs flew in a ballistic arc, reaching a height of about 50 feet before descending toward the water. They hit the surface in an elliptical pattern, approximately 140 feet long and 40 feet wide, oriented along the ship's heading. The pattern was not adjustable. It was determined by the fixed angles of the spigot mortars and the ballistic characteristics of the projectiles. But it was consistent and predictable. Once in the water, the bombs sank at approximately 23 feet per second, faster than depth charges, but still slow enough that the attacking ship could move clear before detonation. Each bomb was equipped with a contact pistol, a mechanical fuse that armed itself after the bomb had been in flight for approximately 3 seconds. This prevented premature detonation if a bomb struck the ship or malfunctioned during launch. The contact pistol was the revolutionary element. Unlike depth charges that detonated at preset depths regardless of whether they were near a target, Hedgehog bombs only exploded if they struck something solid, a submarine hull, a rock formation on the shallow seabed, anything that triggered the contact mechanism. If the bombs missed, they simply sank to the bottom and became inert. The fuses were designed to render themselves safe after a certain depth, preventing dangerous unexploded ordnance on the seabed. This meant 2 things. First, if you heard Hedgehog projectiles hit the water and nothing exploded, you were safe. The attack had missed, completely. Second, if something did explode, it was because a bomb had made direct contact with the submarine. And if one bomb hit, others in the pattern likely hit as well, given the spacing and the size of a U-boat hull. The mathematics were unforgiving. A Type 5 U-boat, the standard German submarine design, was 220 feet long and 20 feet wide at its maximum beam. The Hedgehog pattern was 140 feet long and 40 feet wide. If the pattern was centered correctly on the submarine's position, multiple projectiles would strike the hull. Each projectile carried 32 pounds of Torpex. One bomb, properly placed, could rupture a pressure hull. Multiple hits would guarantee catastrophic failure. The first confirmed U-boat kill by Hedgehog occurred on January 17, 1943. The submarine was U-624, a Type 7C boat commanded by Kapitänleutnant Ulrich von Steinacker. The attacking ship was HMS Viscount, a modified destroyer, escort operating as part of the B-2 escort group protecting convoy ON, 158 inches the North Atlantic. The engagement began conventionally. Viscount's ASDIC operator detected a submerged contact at 1,400 yards, bearing 270 degrees. The captain, Lieutenant Commander R.M. Dixon, ordered the ship to close for attack. U-624 was stalking the convoy, maneuvering into position for a nighttime surface attack on the merchant ships. Von Steinacker heard the destroyer's propellers through his hydrophones and ordered a crash dive. Standard procedure: get deep, go silent, and wait for the depth charges. His crew executed the drill flawlessly. The boat descended rapidly, passing through 100 feet, 150 feet, leveling off at 200 feet. At that depth, they were below the effective range of many ASDIC systems, especially older models. But Viscount carried an upgraded Type 147B ASDIC set specifically designed for deep water tracking. The operator maintained solid contact even as U-624 dove. Dixon adjusted his attack course, bringing the ship onto a heading that would place the submarine directly ahead at a range of 200 yards when the Hedgehog fired. Von Steinacker's hydrophone operator reported the destroyer closing. The sound signature was consistent with an attack run. The crew prepared for depth charging. Men grabbed handholds. The engineering crew monitored the electric motors for any sign of mechanical noise that might give away their position. The control room crew watched their depth gauges and trim indicators, making tiny adjustments to maintain silent running at 200 feet. At a range of 250 yards, Dixon ordered, "Fire Hedgehog." The weapons officer pressed the firing button. 24 spigot mortars fired in sequence. The distinctive cracking sound was audible aboard Viscount as the cartridges detonated. The projectiles arced forward, trailing slight smoke trails visible in the term, overcast daylight. Aboard U-624, the hydrophone operator heard the firing sequence. He reported to von Steinacker, "Destroyer firing weapons. Sounds unfamiliar. Not depth charges." Von Steinacker acknowledged. Unfamiliar weapons could mean rockets or some new device, but the doctrine was the same. Hold position, stay quiet, wait for them to pass. The Hedgehog projectiles struck the water in their elliptical pattern, 200 yards ahead of Viscount and approximately 100 yards ahead of U-624's current position. They sank at 23 feet per second. The submarine was at 200 feet. The bombs would reach that depth in approximately 8.5 seconds. Von Steinacker waited for explosions that would tell him where the pattern had landed, how close, what evasive action to take. The crew counted seconds silently. 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 7 seconds. Nothing. Perhaps the attack had missed completely. Perhaps the unfamiliar weapon had malfunctioned. At 8.7 seconds after water entry, 3 Hedgehog projectiles struck U-624's pressure hull simultaneously. 1 hit the forward torpedo room. 1 hit the control room directly above the conning tower. 1 hit the stern section near the engine room. Each projectile contained 32 pounds of Torpex explosive. The contact pistols functioned as designed. The explosions occurred essentially simultaneously, 3 massive pressure pulses inside critical compartments. The pressure hull ruptured in all 3 locations. Seawater entered the boat under enormous pressure, driven by the weight of 200 feet of ocean above. The forward torpedo room flooded completely in less than 2 seconds. The control room became a maelstrom of water and debris. The stern section, where the explosion breached the main ballast tank, began flooding through multiple openings. U-624 lost all buoyancy instantly. The boat dropped stern first, driven downward by the weight of flooding compartments. Men in the forward sections, those who survived the initial explosions, had no time to react. The water simply took them. Men in the stern tried to reach escape hatches but were thrown off their feet as the deck tilted beyond vertical. The boat passed her crush depth within 30 seconds. At approximately 400 feet, the remaining intact sections of the pressure hull began to fail. Steel plates designed to withstand 7 atmospheres of pressure faced more than double that load. Welds split. Frames buckled. The hull imploded in sections, each failure creating a hammering pressure wave that propagated through the interior. Aboard Viscount, the ASDIC operator reported multiple explosions. The sonar trace showed the target rapidly losing depth, descending far below normal diving range. Dixon ordered the ship to slow and listen. The hydrophone crew reported breaking up noises, the distinctive sounds of structural failure underwater, compressed air escaping, metal tearing, the deep groaning of steel under impossible stress. Then, silence. U-624 was gone. From the moment the Hedgehog fired to the moment the submarine ceased to exist as a functioning vessel was approximately 90 seconds. No one survived. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The loss of U-624 was not immediately understood by Kriegsmarine headquarters. Von Steinacker had not reported his attack position before diving. When U-624 failed to return from patrol, she was listed as missing, presumed lost to unknown causes. The North Atlantic in early 1943 was claiming U-boats at an accelerating rate. Improved radar, better convoy tactics, increased air coverage, all contributed to rising losses. But British naval intelligence was tracking something specific. Ships equipped with Hedgehog were achieving kill rates far exceeding those with conventional depth charges. HMS Viscount's successful attack was the first confirmed kill, but the weapon had been deployed to dozens of escort vessels by early 1943. The Admiralty began compiling statistics. Between January and June of 1943, Hedgehog-equipped ships attacked 53 submarines with solid ASDIC contact. Of those attacks, 14 resulted in confirmed kills, a success rate of 26%. By comparison, depth charge attacks during the same period showed a success rate of approximately 5%. The Hedgehog was 5 times more effective per attack. The operational implications were staggering. An escort group with 6 ships, if all equipped with Hedgehog, could potentially kill 1 or 2 U-boats per convoy battle instead of damaging several and killing none. The weapon was turning submarine warfare into something more definitive. Attacks either missed completely or they killed. There was no middle ground. German intelligence became aware of the Hedgehog through multiple channels. Survivors from U-boats damaged by conventional depth charges and forced to surface sometimes saw the distinctive projector mounting on their attackers before surrendering. Interrogators in Britain, following standard procedure, questioned these survivors about what they knew. Some mentioned hearing unfamiliar firing sounds before their boats were damaged. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft photographed British escort vessels in port and noted the unusual forward-firing weapons installation. Intelligence analysts identified it as some form of mortar or rocket projector, but could not determine its operating principle or effectiveness from photographs alone. The clearest evidence came from U-boat crew survivors picked up after Hedgehog attacks. These men, when they talked at all, described a pattern that was consistent across multiple incidents. Strange cracking sounds, no splash pattern, either nothing happened or sudden catastrophic explosions without warning, no time to evade, no countdown, just instant destruction. In April of 1943, U-191 survived a Hedgehog attack through pure chance. The boat was at 180 feet when HMS Mignonette fired a full pattern. 23 of the 24 projectiles missed. The 24th struck a glancing blow on the port diving plane, a hard surface but not the pressure hull itself. The contact pistol functioned. The explosion damaged the diving plane mechanism and caused minor flooding in the surrounding area, but the pressure hull remained intact. Kapitänleutnant Helmut Mansek, commanding U-191, managed to control the damage and escape. He surfaced after dark, made emergency repairs, and returned to base in France. His patrol report included detailed descriptions of the attack. He noted the forward-firing capability. He reported the contact detonation, the fact that only one projectile exploded despite hearing multiple weapons fired. He emphasized that if the bomb had struck the main hull instead of the diving plane, his boat would have been lost. The report reached Admiral Karl Dönitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U-boat force. Dönitz ordered immediate tactical analysis. If the British had deployed a forward-firing weapon that detonated on contact, the standard depth charge evasion doctrine was compromised. The critical window where the submarine could maneuver while the escort lost ASDIC contact no longer existed. The attacking ship could maintain tracking right up to the moment of firing. Worse, the contact detonation meant near misses counted for nothing. The weapon either hit or it didn't. There was no chance of surviving through depth changes or evasive turns once the pattern was in the water. If the escort calculated your position correctly, you were dead. Dönitz faced an impossible situation. The Hedgehog was operationally deployed across the British and American escort fleets. Intelligence estimates suggested hundreds of ships would carry the weapon by mid-1943. There was no counter-tactic he could recommend that would meaningfully improve survival rates against contact detonation weapons fired while the attacking ship maintained sonar contact. The standard evasion doctrine crash, dive, change course, exploit the blind spot when the escort passed overhead was predicated on depth charges that detonated at preset depths regardless of target proximity. Against Hedgehog, those tactics were worthless. The weapon followed you down. It tracked your actual position, not your estimated position. It only exploded if it hit you, which meant every explosion was a kill. U-boat command issued tactical guidance anyway, because doing nothing was worse for morale than acknowledging the problem. The guidance emphasized going deeper, faster. If you could descend below 300 feet before the projectiles reached your depth, you might create enough lateral separation that the pattern missed. This assumed the escort's ASDIC could track accurately at extreme depths, which newer British systems could, and that your boat could survive at 300 feet, which Type 7 U-boats could barely manage. The operational crush depth for a Type 7C was 280 feet. Some boats had survived brief excursions to 300 feet or slightly beyond, but at that depth, every rivet, every weld, every frame was under stress beyond design limits. Rivets popped, hull plates groaned, leaks developed around pipe penetrations and hatch seals. Even if you survived the Hedgehog attack by going that deep, you risked structural failure from depth pressure alone. Commanders began teaching their crews a grim calculation. If you heard the distinctive crack of Hedgehog firing and then heard nothing, no explosions, you were safe. The attack had missed completely. But if you heard any explosion at all, you had perhaps 2 seconds before catastrophic flooding. In those 2 seconds, experienced crew, members nearest to escape hatches, might save themselves if they reacted instantly. Everyone else would die with the boat. This was not a tactic. This was triage. U-boat crews absorbed this information with varying degrees of acceptance. Veteran submariners who had survived multiple depth charge attacks through skill and quick thinking now faced a weapon where skill mattered less than mathematics. If the escort calculated your position correctly and you were within the pattern diameter, you died. Simple as that. The psychological impact rippled through the U-boat force throughout 1943 and into 1944. Morale, already declining due to mounting losses and improved Allied anti-submarine warfare, deteriorated further. Men volunteered for U-boat service knowing the risks, accepting them as part of their duty. But there is a difference between accepting risk and accepting near-certain death if detected. Hedgehog changed the equation. Detection no longer meant danger. It meant doom. If an escort with Hedgehog gained solid ASDIC contact and maneuvered into attack position, your survival depended entirely on whether their sonar operator calculated your exact depth and bearing correctly. You had no agency in the outcome. You could not outthink the weapon. You could not use superior seamanship to evade it. U-boat commanders, trained to believe their expertise mattered, struggled with this loss of control. Kapitänleutnant Peter Kremer, who survived the war and wrote extensively about his experiences, described the introduction of forward-firing contact weapons as the moment we knew the technical balance had shifted permanently against us. His boat, U-333, survived multiple Hedgehog attacks through chance and the occasional miscalculation by attacking escorts. But Kremer acknowledged that survival was luck, not skill. The statistical reality supported his assessment. Between January 1943 and May 1945, ships, equipped with Hedgehog, sank 91 U-boats. The weapon's success rate improved as escort crews gained experience with the firing solutions and ASDIC operators refined their tracking techniques. By late 1944, experienced Hedgehog crews were achieving success rates approaching 40% on attacks with solid sonar contact. 40% meant that nearly half of all attacks resulted in kills. For U-boat crews, this meant that if you were detected by a competent escort with Hedgehog, your odds of survival were roughly even. Compared to the 70 to 80% survival rate against conventional depth charges, this represented a catastrophic degradation of survivability. The Kriegsmarine tried technical countermeasures. BOLD was a chemical decoy system, canisters that released calcium hydride, which reacted with seawater to create hydrogen bubbles. The bubbles created false sonar echoes, potentially confusing ASDIC operators about the submarine's true position. BOLD worked reasonably well against depth charge attacks, because even a small error in position estimation meant the pattern missed. Against Hedgehog, BOLD was less effective because the escort maintained contact until the moment of firing. The sonar operator could see multiple returns, the false echoes from BOLD and the genuine return from the submarine hull, and could often distinguish between them based on the quality and consistency of the echo. Experienced operators learned to ignore the obviously false returns and track the solid contact. The human cost of the Hedgehog's effectiveness is documented in the patrol reports that U-boats stopped filing, in the crews that failed to return, in the survivors whose interrogation transcripts reveal a consistent pattern of shock and helplessness. One particularly detailed account comes from Oberleutnant zur See Friedrich Dietz, the second watch officer aboard U-845. His boat was sunk by USS Bronstein on March 10, 1944, using Hedgehog. Dietz survived because he was in the conning tower when the projectiles struck. The explosions breached the pressure hull in the control room and engine room, but left the conning tower intact long enough for Dietz and 3 other men to escape through the bridge hatch as the boat sank. Dietz's interrogation report, now declassified and available in naval archives, provides extraordinary detail about the final moments of U-845. He described hearing the Hedgehog firing, the strange cracking sounds that the crew initially did not recognize. He described the brief moment of hope when nothing exploded immediately, the assumption that whatever the Americans had fired had missed. Then, the impact. Dietz estimated 3 or 4 projectiles struck the hull nearly simultaneously. He was standing at the periscope station in the conning tower when the control room below him suddenly flooded. The boat's commander, Kapitänleutnant Otto Wollschläger, was in the control room. He died. Instantly, along with most of the control room crew, Dietz ordered the men in the conning tower to open the bridge hatch. The boat was already sinking stern first, the angle increasing rapidly as water filled the aft compartments. 2 men got through the hatch before the inrushing water pressure made it impossible to push the hatch open further. Dietz and 1 other man rode the conning tower down as the boat sank, trapped in an air pocket that compressed as depth increased. At approximately 100 feet, the remaining air pressure equalized with the water pressure outside. The hatch blew open from the compressed air escaping. Dietz and the other man were blown out of the conning tower by the explosive decompression. Both managed to reach the surface. The other man, a machinist's mate whose name Dietz could not remember during interrogation, died from the bends shortly after being pulled from the water. Dietz survived, along with 2 men from the conning tower who had escaped earlier. 46 men died aboard U-845. Dietz told his interrogators that from the moment the Hedgehog projectiles struck to the moment the conning tower sank below the surface was less than 60 seconds. He emphasized the speed. There was no time to organize abandoned ship procedures, no time for men trapped in flooded compartments to reach escape hatches. The boat simply died, and most of the crew died with it. Similar accounts appear in interrogation reports from other survivors. The consistent elements are the speed of the attack, the lack of warning, and the complete absence of any effective countermeasure. Men describe feeling helpless, betrayed by equipment and doctrine that had promised them a fighting chance. U-boat crews had always accepted the possibility of death. They understood the risks of submarine warfare, but they had believed their training and their commander's expertise gave them reasonable odds of survival if they executed properly. The Hedgehog removed that belief. It made survival a matter of whether the attacking ship's sonar operator aimed correctly, nothing more. The psychological literature on combat stress distinguishes between controllable and uncontrollable threats. Soldiers can function under enormous stress if they believe their actions influence outcomes. They struggle when they feel helpless, when survival seems random or dependent on factors beyond their control. The Hedgehog pushed U-boat combat into that second category. Dönitz recognized this. In a conference with Hitler in July of 1944, recorded in the War Diary of the Naval High Command, Dönitz stated that U-boat losses had reached unsustainable levels. He cited improved Allied anti-submarine weapons, including forward-throwing contact bombs, as a primary factor. He requested resources to develop new U-boat types with better depth capability and quieter machinery. Hitler approved the development of Type XXI and Type XX3I boats, but these would not enter service until 1945, far too late to affect the campaign's outcome. Meanwhile, existing U-boats continued to sail on patrols with decreasing life expectancy. In 1944, the average U-boat had a statistical survival time of approximately 1.7 patrols before being sunk or damaged beyond repair. This meant that more than half of all boats were lost on their first or second patrol. For crews, this translated to grim odds. If you volunteered for U-boat service in 1944, your chances of surviving the war were less than 30%. These statistics were not secret within the U-boat force. Men knew the losses. They knew friends and classmates from training who had sailed and never returned. They knew that the weapon technology had shifted against them, that the British and Americans had developed systems that made submarine warfare vastly more dangerous than it had been in 1940 or 1941. Yet they continued to sail, some from duty, some from belief in the cause, some because refusing duty was punishable by death and brought shame to their families. The reasons varied, but the outcome was consistent. Young men climbed into steel tubes, submerged beneath the Atlantic, and died in numbers that made the U-boat service one of the most lethal assignments in any military force during the war. The Hedgehog remained in service with Allied navies long after World War II ended. The weapon's simplicity and effectiveness made it a standard anti-submarine armament through the 1950s. Some escort vessels carried Hedgehog into the 1960s, though by then more sophisticated weapons like the squid mortar and homing torpedoes had superseded it for frontline service. The United States Navy adopted Hedgehog widely, installing it on destroyer escorts, patrol craft, and some larger destroyers. American production added thousands of Hedgehog systems to the Allied arsenal, ensuring that nearly every escort vessel in the Atlantic and Pacific had access to forward-firing contact weapons by late 1944. The weapon's operational record speaks clearly. Of the 782 German U-boats lost during World War II, 91 were sunk by Hedgehog. This represents nearly 12% of all U-boat losses, achieved by a weapon that was only widely deployed for the final 2.5 years of the war. If you calculate success rate per attack, rather than total kills, Hedgehog's effectiveness becomes even more pronounced. The weapon achieved kills on roughly 30% of attacks with solid sonar contact, compared to 5% for conventional depth charges. Post-war analysis by both British and American naval researchers confirmed what combat results had suggested. The Hedgehog's forward-firing capability and contact detonation represented a fundamental improvement in anti-submarine warfare. The weapon allowed escorts to maintain sonar contact throughout the attack, dramatically improving accuracy. The contact fusing meant that hits were kills, eliminating the uncertainty of near-miss damage assessment that plagued depth charge attacks. German naval officers, interviewed after the war, acknowledged the Hedgehog's impact. Admiral Dönitz, in his memoirs, listed forward-firing contact weapons as one of several technological developments that made U-boat operations unsustainable by mid-1944. He ranked it alongside improved radar, increased air coverage, and better convoy tactics as factors that shifted the Battle of the Atlantic decisively against Germany. Individual U-boat commanders who survived the war expressed similar assessments. The consistent theme in their accounts is the loss of tactical agency. Against depth charges, a skilled commander could increase his odds through expert seamanship and quick decision-making. Against Hedgehog, those skills mattered less. The weapon was too accurate, too fast, and too unforgiving. This is the profound irony at the heart of the Hedgehog story. The weapon that most thoroughly defeated German U-boats was not a technological marvel. It was not radar-guided or computer-aimed. It was a simple spigot mortar firing contact-fused bombs in a fixed pattern. The innovation was not in complexity, but in understanding the problem correctly and solving it with elegant simplicity. British weapons designers recognized that depth charges failed primarily because they had to be dropped from directly above the target, requiring the escort to lose sonar contact during the final approach. By moving the weapon forward and firing ahead of the ship, they maintained contact. By using contact fusing instead of depth fusing, they eliminated near misses. The solution was mechanically simple but operationally transformative. For the men of U-415, whose deaths opened this story, the Hedgehog represented something they could not have understood in their final seconds. They died not because they failed to execute proper tactics, not because their commander made errors, not because their crew was inadequately trained. They died because the fundamental equation of submarine warfare had changed, and no amount of skill or courage could compensate for that change. Kapitänleutnant Hans-Joachim Hesse, standing in his control room at 180 feet, waiting for depth charges that never came, could not have known that the strange cracking sounds overhead represented a weapon that made his entire tactical doctrine obsolete. He executed properly. His crew performed their duties correctly. The boat was mechanically sound. None of it mattered. When the Hedgehog projectiles struck his pressure hull 4 seconds after firing, the explosions that killed him and 42 of his crew were not the result of bad luck or superior enemy skill. They were the result of technological evolution in warfare, the kind of shift that periodically renders existing equipment and tactics obsolete, regardless of the expertise of the men using them. This is what the Kriegsmarine never expected and could never effectively counter. Not a superweapon or a secret technology, but a simple mechanical improvement that removed the margins where skill could make a difference. The Hedgehog did not need to be sophisticated, it just needed to work. And it worked with brutal, mechanical efficiency. The story of the Hedgehog is ultimately about the mathematics of modern warfare. In industrial combat between peer adversaries, tactical innovation can shift outcomes dramatically. The side that solves key problems, first in this case, the problem of maintaining sonar contact during attack runs, gains advantages that courage and training cannot overcome. For U-boat crews in the final 2 years of the war, this meant sailing on patrols knowing that detection increasingly meant death. Not possible death, not likely death, but near certain death if the detecting ship carried Hedgehog and had a competent crew. The weapon removed hope, which may be the most psychologically devastating thing any combat system can do. When those strange cracking sounds echoed through the North Atlantic on that morning in July 1944, they announced not just another attack, but the final obsolescence of an entire tactical system. The men who heard those sounds, and then felt their boats rupture around them, learned the hardest lesson of industrial warfare: that expertise means nothing when the technology shifts beneath you. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.